Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name's Don Robinson. I'm Beverly Reddy. There we go, it's me. Hi, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to SMAdvancedForum, your monthly roundup of all things informal around the business, art and technology of streaming. As always, I am Don Robinson, one of the hosts. I'm going to bring apologies from Mark, because he's had two babies since we last spoke at the beginning of January. So he's now sleepless in San Diego, and he's sending his apologies, not because of the baby, but he's actually been a little bit ill himself. So with no further ado, I'm going to cut the camera to Tim. Tim's waving at me on the camera, so I'm going to cut the camera to Tim. What's been up to? Tim, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Actually, I wasn't. Pop in the This is Michelle, right? And besides Mark having by the time he speaks next, of course, next month is International Women's Day, and we all Michelle and I will have been married, which is March 1st.
Eric will be there as our SMAF, and of course, he's streaming it live from his iPhone for that.
Well, and that's precisely when you were asking about streaming. I probably will have to. Steve Nathan will also be here.
You need to black wedding.
Oh, there we go. That's actually great. We'll put it in our register.
Don't let him do that.
All right. She's over today because we had really bad flooding here in the area, and our schools actually closed the entire county. All right, so besides working on wedding invitations and all that fun stuff, did I go to CES after or before our last? After. Yeah. And I'll talk a little bit about what I saw at CES later. That's it. I've been writing source book articles like crazy for Eric, and he's also asked me to chair one of the days there at Streaming Media West. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You're doing one. I'm going to be doing one now. Eric, what have you been up to besides receiving all of our source book articles and desperately trying to edit everything?
Well, that's all done, which means I can move on to programming Streaming Media East in earnest. For those who don't know, we're moving from New York to Boston this year. I'm looking forward to the venue. New York obviously is great for so many reasons, but the change of pace will be nice too. So hopefully, and Krystal, I'll certainly be reaching out to you, possibly to speak there. But yes, as Tim said, we're going to have a couple of tracks that he and Dom will be heading up. Dom will be chairing our Content Delivery Summit this year, which he basically did last year, but this is his first year as official chair of it. Tim, you'll be doing the Enterprise Communication Video Summit within the broad, under the broad Streaming Media East umbrella. And then we've got our OTT Summit, Video Engineering and Technology Summit. Those are both 2 days each, 2 tracks. And we also have a 1-day esports and sports streaming summit. So I got a lot of slots to fill. So if you're out there watching, you are all interested in speaking at the event, streamingmedia.com/east. There's a speaker submission form. Please do get in touch.
And we're doing it at the Weston Commons there, which for me is like returning home, because when I worked in Cambridge, I would constantly stay at that hotel. It's actually really good hotel. All right, from a guest standpoint, let's start with Krystal. Introduce yourself. Tell us what company you're with, and a little bit about you.
Ladies first. I'm a software engineer at CBS Interactive. My name is Krystal Mejia, for those that don't know me. I focus on mostly video processing within the video pipeline streaming. I work within video technology team at Interactive, so we're a platform team, so we focus on creating technology and services to really empower all the different brands that fall under the CBS Interactive umbrella. And I've been with CBS my whole career that I've been streaming, all 3 years.
Oh, nice. So you would do encoded workflows and that type of thing as part of it, or primarily out?
No, so I work on encoded workflows. My team specifically, we do video processing team, so we focus from ingest to packaging and delivery of the origins. My focus was primarily live for the first 2 years, specifically when I was working for CBS Sports Digital with CBS Interactive. Lately, I've been doing VOD for the last 6 months.
Which do you prefer? It's interesting. I live in the world of live.
So, I mean, I'm still kind of teetering on the edge of live. I still help out on the live system as much as possible. So I miss live, but it's been something to work in VOD, focusing more on like video quality as a whole.
Yeah. I get that. Transmission is much more important than that reverse.
So I'm curious. Is CBS Interactive in the older Viacom video team? Is that the same team? Because I know Viacom and CBS are they completely?
Right. So like prior to the merger, Interactive was just the technical arm within the CBS corporation. As far as I know, we're still our own team within the Viacom CBS organization. Viacom Digital, I think, is still a separate team.
Okay, yeah, we all had a good friend, Jeff Tapper, who worked for Viacom for quite a while, so I was curious on that. Nice. All right, and then we have another Dominic, and I've been told that the nicknames between the two DOMs are D1 and D2. Before I go to D1, I want D2 to explain sort of how this happens, because you mentioned before we went live, but we're going to refer to both the DOMs as D1 and D2 today. But Dom Robinson, go ahead and explain this as D2.
I'm actually just going to interject before I explain. And Nadine and Mark, there we go. Nadine says it's better now. Good. This is what I like on a live webcast, is getting webcasters in the chat room who can actually give you very clear feedback directly into the chat room to tell you what's going on with the webcast, and you can fix it, which I did. So anyway, now you can hear us all properly without the echo, and apologies for that. The story behind D2 and D1. So that I was working on a festival in it was either so long ago or I was so wasted I can't remember, but it was about the mid-90s somewhere. And there was another Dom working on production, and the radios were confusing everyone. So I adopted the moniker D2, and then I use that as my tag for all sorts of things online. What's the proper term for that in geeky term? I don't know. I should know, because I'm reading a book about the cult of the dead cow now, and there's so many weird names in that. Anyway, so I adopted the moniker D2, and then some years later I met this other Dom through a variety of different crossing paths. And he asked if the original D1 slot was taken, and he has since then squatted it. So yes, do call me D2 and him D1, and we'll react like our mothers called us from the kitchen.
We'll respond appropriately, yeah.
Well, so I have a question. In the U.S., our mothers calling from the kitchen if they call us by our full name. Timothy for me, or Timothy James. That means you're in trouble. Is it Dominic over there? If someone calls you Dominic, does that mean you're in trouble, or is it just...
If someone calls me Dominic, it's either my mum or the bank.
And the bank is looking for something that they want to know that they have the right Dominic. So
that's right, exactly. No, I don't know who Dominic is. Never heard of him. My name's D2. Bye-bye.
Somebody else in time.
All right. So D1 or Dominic Pates, tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of where your background is in the industry.
Evening, afternoon, morning to you, wherever you are. I met D2 about 20 years ago, so long-standing friends here. I'm kind of the fish out of water, the square peg here. So I'm in higher education. I'm at a university that is part of the University of London. which is kind of a university federation. There's, I don't know, 20 universities that are part of the University of London here. And I'm at one called City. And I'm an educational technologist here. And that's usually the kind of job role that requires explaining, particularly to the academics that we work with. And streaming is a component to that. But I kind of shorthand it with I help academics to use digital technologies in their teaching. That's kind of one component to it. I also do things like I help with the design of learning spaces, lecture theatres, things like that, and obviously AV and the streaming component is part of that. And there's things like innovation is part of my remit as well. So it covers a multitude of things, and streaming is kind of a component to that.
So that's interesting that you say that, because Eric, of course, has taught. I've taught at university as well, and taught in smart classrooms, right. Which, depending on the era the smart classroom came from, it either meant there was a camera in the back of the room that you did distance education, or it meant you truly had a smart board or something along those lines. You said streaming's a part of it, so you've got. In the past, we had companies like Sonic Foundry or MediaSite who would package up solutions that could be for either subject matter experts within the enterprise or for lectures in the, in the education space. One of the big problems with those solutions was it was really difficult to find content once you hit scale in terms of the library of content. So I spent a couple of years working with indexing, search, and retrieval companies. Is that for your, not your audience, which is the professor, but for their audience, which is the students, are they sort of expecting that they could go directly to a part of the lecture and find that information, or are they sort of content to watch through the whole lecture if they watch it after the fact?
That's a good question. I mean, I'll kind of answer it in a little bit of a roundabout way.
That would be the educational approach.
It's the only way. It's a bit of academic answer as well. So, I mean, higher education is kind of it's an unusual space. It's got scale and it's got budget, but it doesn't have agility in its movement. So that's my sort of first caveat. So you can raise big funds for getting equipment, for big capital projects, for all sorts of things, and you got eyeballs, but it takes so long to get anything up and running that it just can't really operate at the same sort of pace as other things, as the commercial sector. And you also find that it means that it's a lot harder for the commercial sector to get an in, because it's just this sort of weird space that just doesn't move at the same sort of timescales as other things. So when I say components to streaming in higher education these days, I mean in City's experience, which is fairly symptomatic of at least British higher education, that largely means two things. One of them is both pretty much video related. One of them is lecture capture, is what is commonly known as lecture capture in higher education. And that's essentially a recording of a live class that is made available after the event. So it's not any retrieval of existing information. It's just making sure that you record the lecture or the class. The other thing as well is Kaltura is one of the big players in this particular space is video hosting as well. So we all serve the YouTube generation these days, and the likes of Kaltura serve as a kind of YouTube within the walled garden of higher education. So it's a space for professors to record themselves talking over their slides and save them having to go in front of a class, and they can put it out to the virtual learning environment, and there's a little video hosting platform for them.
And I was saying Kaltura sort of when they got started, because I remember when Ron and David and some of the others had that idea, they were looking to tie it in with Blackboard or Moodle or some of the other learning management systems. Is that still a component? You've got an LMS and you've got the video hosting and sort of the linkage of the two of those together?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, our instance of the Kaltura system is integrated into our instance of Moodle.
Moodle.
And
Okay.
very nicely easy to get into it, and it means that for the academic that wants it, video can be a core component to their toolbox, if you like. But then we have to teach them how to use it, and that's the challenging part.
This is true. Okay, so I'm going to switch topics just a little bit here, since we've got both D1 and D2 sitting on an island off the coast of Europe, but no longer part of Europe, or at least by the end of the year. Let's talk about the impact of Brexit on licensing models. And D2, I'm going to throw that one to you first, and then we'll see what the higher ed angle.
Well, I think on that, then, what I better do is just bring the article that I think you're referring to. Wrong article. Hold on. Bring up the article you're referring to, which was this one. And I realised I should have white balanced that camera. But anyway, this is an interesting article out in Digital TV earlier this week. What's the stat that they gave? So the number of TV services licensed by the UK regulator Ofcom declined to 879 in December, down from 1,039 in 2018. And according to research, a further 319 channels may need to relocate in order to continue enjoying unfettered access to the EU market. So, as far as the local operation and play out of channels in the UK is going, and very much something that I'm picking up on the street, is that play out services in a number of the larger digital asset management houses and people like satellite operators and so on, play out is upping sticks or closing down or outright closing down up in London. So those of you who've been working in play out, or maybe still are working in play out in London, I think that Brexit is going to present some change. I think that's about as diplomatic as I'm going to get.
And what kind of change would that be?
D1, what do you think?
It certainly is going to present some change. And it's it's interesting to one needs to be diplomatic in a context like this, but it certainly brings a whole range of challenges as well. I mean, it throws massive challenges for higher education because we're very deeply integrated with pan-European sort of research funding. A lot of our academics come from originate from the EU member states themselves, so it's what happens to their own visa statuses. A lot of our students do as well, and then we got simple things like we were talking about the LMS earlier on as well, or the higher education worries a lot about GDPR. What happens to our data centers? I mean, our lecture capture system was previously hosted at the University of London's computer center, and then we shifted to AWS. So what does that mean? Is that hosted in Ireland? Is that going to be hosted here? So it raises challenges and brings changes.
And I've got a nice segue actually to Krystal, because presumably CBS are one of the licensors of a number of BBC content and so on. And if we can't get a trade deal in place with you guys, that presumably changes. Actually, I'm speaking off the cuff there. I don't know if it's going to have any effect, but it begs the question: will pricing of content exported from the UK to the US market? I don't know if anyone's got any awareness if that'll change, but Krystal, have you heard anything on the wires about that sort of thing?
No, I mean, that's something that's handled on the business side of the organization. I'm heads down focused on bits and bytes, optimizing our stream. So yeah,
don't force the software engineer to actually talk about.
I was trying to do a segue there. I'll leave that to you, Tim. I'll just go.
Let me actually. I want to go back to something D1 said though, which is the researchers, even the professors, that speak within Europe as a whole now. I worked on Framework Package 6 a number of years ago in Switzerland, and we actually had 13 research institutes from around Europe, including University of Edinburgh Informatics, which was really, really good at what they did with intellectual property. On the flip side, we had University of Brno, who wasn't allowed to patent anything. They had to give everything away based on their model. What you're describing, it sounds fairly horrific for those cross-research approaches. Am I understanding correctly that essentially those kinds of discussions about how that might play out haven't really been had or even thought through?
Well, I mean, higher education is symptomatic of any other sector that membership of the EU and no longer membership of the EU impacts on. So you find that nobody really knows yet. We
still have the EC model as opposed to the EU model, so some of those may perhaps still,
So, I mean, another one, for example, so there's the Erasmus program here. And I don't know if folks are familiar with the Erasmus program, but this is something that allows staff and students to spend paid time in another European institution and get to another program, or you get paid from the European Union to actually go and hang out in Norway for a week, even though that's not in the EU, or go to Brussels, or and it's part of the the wider sharing of information. So until so research funding through Horizon 2020, the Erasmus scheme, cross-border collaborations on all sorts of research projects, we just don't know until some sort of deal is put in place, whatever that will be.
And just to pick up a bit of relevance on that, so a lot of the UK's participation in organisations like MPEG has been, if not completely paid for, significantly subsidised by organisations like Erasmus, and so it begs the question now who we apply to get funding to participate in organisations like MPEG. Which directly affects whether we get involved in things like the MPEG Dash Playground and other projects that have been, established in Europe or with European funding that we have hitherto been able to participate in. We're no longer sure if we can do that. So,
and that actually provides a perfect segue to Krystal. So, so Krystal, one of the things you had, we're talking about MPEG Dash, it made me think about AV1, and one of the things you wanted to touch base on was AV1. One of the issues that I've seen in the past, and I've been lucky enough to have Tarek from Twitch on both panels as well as doing interviews with him, when he talked about sort of the multi-codec world that they had to move from H.264 to VP9, and of course now Netflix is saying they're going to try to move off VP9 to AV1 because they get about a 20% data savings. Well, how does that impact you as a software engineer when you're working to optimize workflows around X264 and other things like that, and suddenly you're thrown this new codec, which, while it definitely has data savings, may not have the workflow enhancements that you necessarily come to expect in your H.264 workflow?
Yeah, I mean, ever since I started my career, like I came in and it was a lot of how HEVC and VP9 had huge gains on like AVC, but even then you still saw that AVC had huge adoptions across the industry and people were still using that widely. So I feel like I've always lived in this multi-codec world. It feels to me like a lot of it comes down to devices and the user, what devices users are using in the market. So, for AV1, for Netflix to launch this is great. I want more adoption in the industry, especially when you consider the gains that you're getting. I think a lot about saving on data, and so saving on bandwidth. If we can facilitate that, that would be great. So I've always been curious with AV1, what adoption is going to look like industry-wide, and how it's going to compare to like HEVC and VP9 in the way that those were adopted.
Where's the licensing at the moment with AV1? as a broad thing? Is AV1, has it achieved its aims of being completely royalty free?
That's the goal. Is it's royalty free? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting game changer.
Well, and also, you mentioned VP9, Krystal. In back when VP9 sort of, came under the Google umbrella after On2 sold VP8 and they repackaged it, did the indemnification, you still didn't really see a lot of adoption, as you're saying. And so the constraint right now, it seems like, is essentially Netflix, who is part of the Alliance for Open Media. It almost feels like they're forcing it into Android devices and forcing the consumer to make the choice on data savings without educating the consumer as to the fact that it will look equivalent. Do you get that sense, or do you get the sense the education has been done for consumers?
I'm not sure where the education is for consumers. When I first saw that they launched it on Android, I didn't even realize like the little asterisk that said you had to turn on data saving within your device. So yeah, I mean, if I talk normally to just like my millennial friends who just consume media, they don't understand the difference of like what a codec or how a codec could optimize their experience.
But plus which, they're on unlimited data plans, so why do they need to save data? That sort of seems to me one of those general questions.
Yeah, exactly.
So have you all been working on AV1 workflows alongside HEVC and AVC, or is it still primarily been focused on AVC?
We still do a lot of AVC, HEVC. That's still primary focus. I think, depending on where the industry goes, I think as we see more adoption, we'll start to adopt those codecs more readily. I definitely see that in the future.
Okay. And D1, what about you from a higher education standpoint? Is everything centralized around H.264? Is there still Windows Media? Because I know that has been a thing in the education space for quite some time. Or are you
Real media, yeah.
branching into new codecs like HEVC and AV1?
I think it's hard to say that there's consistency in HE. I mean, I'm still seeing academics trying to upload WMV files to and expect that to download and render on a student device rather than it being something that is streamed. So, even we wouldn't even go into giving them an understanding of the codec side behind it.
So is that one of the reasons to use a video platform? Is that transcoding capability? Just trying to keep up with all the newest codecs, or is the platform more for the fact that you don't have to do the capital expenditure to buy your own servers and maintain them? I
mean, that's one thing. It also sort of makes it a lot easier. It ingests a few more different formats as well, and some of our students will have bandwidth considerations as well. So it's there's no reason to send files around anymore. So.
Very true. All right, Eric, as our resident football expert, did you watch the Super Bowl? I mean, with a team, of course, that gets relatively close every so often, Green Bay.
Thanks for the reminder. They once again got relatively close.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So did you? Well, first of all, you had some good news a couple of weeks ago that one of the former coaches at Green Bay has now gone to, is it the Carolina Panthers?
No, he's in Dallas now.
In Dallas.
Right. So he can hopefully ultimately perform poorly there as he ended up performing here. But yeah, I did watch the Super Bowl and rooted for the Kansas City Chiefs to defeat the 49ers, who defeated the Packers. But as I was thinking about topics for today, we've talked often about latency, particularly as it pertains to live sports. And, Dom, I know, or D2, I should say, has always sort of dismissed the whole, the cliche that we hear at every industry conference about, well, you don't want to find out about the goal on Twitter before you find out about it, before you see it on your screen. And Dom, I don't think that's apocryphal at all, because I finally decided to stop watching the NFL playoffs on Hulu, and instead made sure my antenna was working, because I've got a chat group with my brother-in-law and my son and my nephew about the games, and so they'd be saying things in response to what they had seen watching the game over the air or on cable a good 30 seconds before I saw what they saw. And it was ruining the experience for me.
There's a do not disturb feature on the phone, dude.
No, this is, but I want
The whole
what
idea
you're
of the
missing,
group is to trash talk
Dom,
each other.
Put it in a box.
what you're missing is this is not a push notification. This is and those discussions that people have on Twitter. So this was in iMessages, right? This was in messages.
You're sitting there
This is in
saying he was a
messages, but-
terrible player. He kicked the ball
Right.
or did whatever he did wrong. Right. Okay.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and that's a real thing among sports fans, and it's a pervasive thing. And so no, if it's not so much, it's not getting a push notification about something that happened, as much as it is sort of participating in the fan experience with others who are not in the room with you, and that's where latency makes a difference.
Well, and Dom, I'll put it in perspective from the UK football, not US football. I was living in the French part of Switzerland, working in Italy when Italy and France were in the World Cup, and Zidane headbutted the Italian, and all hell broke loose effectively. If I'd been sitting in a bar or sitting outside a bar watching it on a stream, I wouldn't have been able to figure out why there was so much yelling for a minute before I actually saw the clip on there. Yeah, latency is definitely a huge issue. Eric, did you notice when you were watching the playoffs on Hulu that it would be consistently 30 seconds behind, or would it rise to a minute, 2 minutes, like we used to see a couple of years ago with the Super Bowl or other big action sports?
Well, that's a good point, and because I didn't watch the Super Bowl on Hulu, I don't know where it was at during the Super Bowl, and I haven't been able to find any reports on that. But during the end of the regular season and the early playoff games, it was consistently about 30 seconds.
Okay.
Wow.
So it's not like as the audience scaled, the latency got significantly worse, I don't think.
Which may be better, because that was the issue we did have a couple of years ago, is as the audience would scale for high points in a game, it would delay. I remember the initial time I watched it on a stream, it ended up 2 minutes behind at the end of the Super Bowl as opposed to
right.
So I'm going to jump in there. So Krystal, actually, you've obviously worked a lot with live workflows, at least until 6 months ago. But the sort of low latency thing has been a massive thing for, I just said, 2.5 years now, maybe 3 years. It's sort of been the hot news. Every conference, every seminar has got a latency session. Even though there's just nothing more to say about it, but in your mind, we're currently building for one of the big CDNs. We're building a global low latency sub-second CDN. It's possible to do this technology. There seems to be a reluctance to move away from HTTP delivery to achieve some of the sub-second latency. So the sort of commoditization of HTTP in the CDN seems to have made it more of an issue than it is technically. It seems to be a business decision in my mind. What's your take on it all at the moment?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, or even when I'm focusing on live, latency is important. It's like top 3 things that I think about when I'm building a service, but it does take a backseat to things like the quality of experience and the quality of service. A huge thing is trying to tackle all 3 of those at once, and it's really hard to achieve gains in all 3 at the same time. And so for things like Super Bowl, which about a year ago this was us, it was how do we scale our infrastructure without going backwards in terms of the quality of our experience and the quality of our service, and latency is something we would definitely we would tackle that last for the sake of our users care more about rebuffering than they do about how delayed the game is. But with that said, if you have a 2 minutes of latency, that to me is a huge issue, and you need to try to keep it within, I think 30 seconds is pretty safe. We operate at like 6-second segments, and so we have about 18 to 27 seconds of delay in latency. And so with a game like Super Bowl, though, you also have like broadcast delays that are inherently within that attributes to the latency that you're seeing on digital.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, Eric. So where's your fine line? Do you think it's necessary to get sub-second?
I think what's important, as Krystal just said, really is to reach parity with broadcast. That's the bottom line for large scale live events. That's what's important.
So essentially, what you're saying is it doesn't matter how long the delay is, as long as the person that you're trash talking with through messages is having the equivalent delay. And I ask that seriously
because it's about sync.
And it's about syncing another 20 years and we'll catch up in HE as well.
That'll be your first broadcast getting through.
Audio and video not being synced. But Don Robinson, I mean, I think this is one of the things one of your colleagues, Adrian, has talked about is synchronization is key. It doesn't necessarily matter how much latency as long as what we're seeing on multiple devices come through at the same time. And Krystal pointed out the broadcast delays, and that sort of gives you a little bit of a step forward. Obviously, 18 to 30 seconds is longer than the delay you're going to get on cable or even satellite. But maybe as we move down that process to 7-8 second delay, we'll get relatively close to the way that cable distribution is done.
Yeah, I mean, there's no technical reason why we shouldn't keep pushing that boundary and pushing that line. I think there's probably more scope for reducing latency by percentages than there is for reducing compression by percentages now. I think investment into latency, if that's an important metric, is probably going to show better benefit for investment than codec, because codec has that inherent challenge of being rolled out afterwards, or back catalogs being transcoded and so on. So, but they're both trade-offs, I think.
Yeah, and I do think ultimately you are seeing a lot in the industry, the push for tackling latency. Apple released their spec last year for HTTP2 push to do like ultra low latency. CDNs are moving services closer to the edge so that companies can work with that, and I'm sure that will help a lot with latency. So it's definitely something industry-wide in streaming we're pushing for.
It's interesting you mentioned the ultra-low latency from Apple, because, of course, Pantos spoke at the Streaming Media West session. I think we spoke about this on the last SMAF edition as well. I found it interesting, the one question which I put at the end of the session to him, and I think he hedged his answer, was that if you introduce an ultra-low latency HLS spec, who's going to opt for the high latency one? Is it needed anymore? Is it just going to supersede it? So, it is an interesting part of the debate at the moment.
Well, and I think Krystal brings up a good point. It's sort of premised on HTTP2 push. If you're not building your servers that way, you can get away with the sort of standard 6-second segment, 3 segments being pushed out kind of thing. If you do want to do the partial segments from what he talked about with low latency HLS, you have to have an HTTP2 push infrastructure in place. And to a certain extent, that almost becomes the problem you've addressed multiple times, D2, about multicast. We could do multicast. You just have to have the infrastructure in place where everybody can receive it.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting. Nadine's just popped in a question on the chat room there, which is her question was, what's going to cost less, doing shorter segments or redeveloping the CDN delivery? In my mind, you hit the nail on the head with that question, actually, Nadine, which is that we're going to see a bit of a schism and a ground shift in CDN architecture over the next 18 months. And that's because edge compute is becoming mature enough, and CDNs are naturally very experienced with orchestration of distributed services at scale, deep at the edge. There's proxying approaches, just spinning up varnish and keeping everything in HTTP. But there's also compute approaches where you might start spinning up proper new session-based protocols at the edge. So where historically running a session-based protocol like RTP or WebRTC and so on was a considerable staffing, skill, resource overhead to run in parallel to your HTTP facility at the edge of your CDN. Of course, if you can say to the customers, well, we're an edge compute environment, run what the hell you like at the edge of the CDN, those CDNs, I think, will have scope to offer these niche capabilities and even semi-proprietary capabilities to each of their customers without internally having to incorporate the overhead of managing that complex new service. That's the customer's problem. They're just providing the network and the compute services. In the same way that Amazon doesn't care what type of server you run on EC2, it just charges you for the CPU and the bandwidth. And as that's becoming more de rigueur as the way to do things, I think that will change the dynamics. So I think the cost will reduce. And yes, Nadine, who asked the question, is on next month. In fact, let's just plug it now. Next month, of course, Krystal is our representative this month, but every month we always invite someone from Women in Streaming Media to take part. We think they're a great organisation and they have some of the cooler parties at the big events. So long may they continue. And we're going to be in honour of Women in Streaming, in honour of International Women's Day, which falls, I think, actually on the Saturday immediately after SMAF, but it's as close as we could possibly imagine, being on the first Thursday of every month. Next month, you won't see any of the normal the normal hosts, but I believe Nadine and Peggy and a crowd from the Women in Streaming Media will be doing a SMAF takeover. So you'll have a break from, well, certainly my ugly face. You probably want to see Tim and Eric's, but
exactly. Yep. Yeah, no, and I think that's awesome that we're going to be able to hand the reins over on that, because it's been something that all of us have been very keen to see, is more diversity in the industry, you know, especially from a gender standpoint. And just, I love the fact that we can have engineers on, whether they're male or female, to talk about technical things, and business people as well from all parts of the spectrum. So Krystal, thank you for being the representative this month on it. And honestly, I love when we get to have deep discussions around technical, whether it's here or at the streaming media shows, because for me, that incentive for the next generation to see that it's possible to, you know, to step up regardless of your gender and be part of this revolution, I think is really important.
I can hear Michelle sharpening the knife behind you, Tim.
She's a math teacher, Dom, so she's totally there with you on that.
I've heard her take you to pieces on maths. In fact, what a good article you wrote about the maths in streaming media last week? It came out. You wrote your algorithms. Yeah, it's great. Tell us a bit about that, actually, Tim, because we never get to ask you questions. Tell us a bit about that article.
Right. Okay, so Michelle, when she came to IBC with me back in September, went to the Women in Streaming Media event, got a chance to meet a number of the people in the industry. But then we also had lunch with Yuri Resnick, who's one of the fellows at Bright Cove. And I'd asked Yuri to go to lunch, and we sat down at lunch and we were talking about some of the things around player performance and like that. Then he took out a pen and he started writing a math formula. And I had to look at Michelle to get an explanation on it, because I'm not a math person. She is. She's got a degree in full mathematics. And by the end of that,
geeked out.
Yeah, she completely geeked out, and I realized
first thing all weekend that I had actually understood.
And I realized that what we don't do a lot of times in the industry is really talk to people who do those underlying algorithms, the mathematics and like that. So this algorithm series, we started with content delivery networks. The next one's going to be on player performance. And some of the things that Yuri described in that lunch will be a part of the basis of that next article. But no, I'm having fun with that, because these are the people who if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing, both from an engineering standpoint and also from a marketing and business standpoint. So I'm absolutely ecstatic that we're doing that series this year. Hey, Eric, speaking of articles, I had a question for you when we're talking about latency. I know we did an article about a year ago called Latency Sucks, or maybe it was 2 years ago.
I think it, Tim. I think that was 3 years ago now.
Was it? Oh, you're right.
We've been focusing on latency
For
for a
quite
long
some time.
time.
And I did a follow up with Wowza on that, I think 2 years ago. And in fact, they just asked me this week to do a follow up again on it because obviously from a media server standpoint, that's very important. Is that, Dom mentioned that we talk about that at the, at the conferences and all. Are those articles actually fairly popular? I mean, do people sort of resonate with that question about how do we get latency lower, or is it us talking into the echo chamber?
Well, I mean, first of all, you could argue that the streaming media magazine audience and website audience is the echo chamber, right? So I don't know about that distinction, but no, it continues to be a crucial issue. It continues to, those sessions continue to get some of the highest attendance at our events. Those articles continue to perform well relative to other topics on the site. So absolutely, it's and we can joke about how important it is for certain applications, but for particularly, we're talking sports, particularly as in the States, betting becomes more of a widespread occurrence as more and more states legalize it. We're going to have to continue to talk about latency and start talking about it in ways that, where in that case, simply matching broadcast latency isn't enough if people are going to be wagering on the games.
Right, very true. And of course, in the UK, you all have, you've had sports bets for a long time. In the States, you only are allowed to do it at casinos, or like Eric said, as it's becoming now allowable in some of the particular states. D1, on a higher education standpoint, how important is latency for live distance education? I mean, obviously there you'd have some level of interactivity between the professor in one classroom and students that are remote, but is it a topic that comes up frequently?
It's a good question. To be blunt, no. Where it does matter is, damn, I've suddenly overestimated the number of students coming, and I don't have a big enough lecture theatre, so I need to run a stream over into another lecture theatre where the students can go in there, so I can talk to 400 students when I can only fit 200 in a room. So latency's important there, but there's not a great deal of interaction in there.
In those scenarios on campus, it may not even be a stream. It may be something like Extron's video over Twisted Pair or something like that.
Yeah, and the other component you talked about there as well is the other consideration is distance education. That doesn't. I mean, HE has been impacted by MOOCs in perhaps the same way that. Was supposedly the music industry was impacted by the MP3. That's one of the thinking that goes on there. It was supposed to be the disruptive format, but it's a very different thing from the MP3, obviously. And different institutions have responded in different ways to the MOOC model. And for viewers that are not familiar with it, the MOOC is the massive open online course. So that resulted in new organizations like Coursera and Udacity that came out of Silicon Valley, etc. Where essentially you can say, I can just unbundle the university, I can put all the content online, and I can open this up. And institutions like MIT kind of opened up some of this sort of model as well. Started sharing lecture recordings online, and then suddenly you can get a bit of an MIT education, but you got to pay for the certificate at the end.
So, and I know there was sort of that star professor model as well, where the question was who owned the content? Did the professor own it? Did the university, et cetera? So yeah, those kinds of issues, have they been resolved, or is it with MOOC, or is that something that's still sort of outstanding?
I think in terms of academic contracts, the university typically owns it as well, and that's a particular challenge for institutions that rely on visiting lecturers a lot. So ours, we'll have We'll have faculty. I think you'd probably refer to that as tenured academics in the US. But we also rely a lot on experts from industry that will come in and deliver a class, etc. And I mean, their model doesn't quite work in the same way. They want to hold on to their IP a lot more. So when the university does a lecture capture recording and says we own it, the visiting lecturer then says, well, I want to deliver the same lecture down the road at UCL or LSE. Can I take my stuff with me? So it's a big question.
That is interesting. So Dom, sorry, D2, I want to come back to content delivery networks, and you're going to be chairing the Content Delivery Summit. I think I'm going to be helping you do a little bit of moderation so somebody doesn't have to look at you all day. But let's talk about the sort of dynamics of cost as we go into that event in June. You mentioned you're working on an ultra low latency for one of the CDNs, and you feel there's a bifurcation in the industry between sort of those that do edge compute and those that do traditional CDN. What does it do from a cost impact in sort of both of those models?
So naturally, where you've got the mass market sat at the moment on the sort of chunks delivery, which I think is the sort of focus of Nadine's question, then the economics of scale mean that it's relatively cheap to mess around within the confines of that existing infrastructure. And if there's no change to the infrastructure, there's no particular cost to be passed on. So in the short term, it's going to cost, in direct answer to Nadine's question, it's going to cost less to do shorter segments rather than redevelop the CDN. However, over time, it's an inevitability that the CDNs are going to develop edge compute strategies because they've been doing it for 10 years longer than the public clouds have. And they're in a better position in layer 4 and they're a skill within orchestration of layer 3 than even the carrier networks underneath them are. So it's an inevitability that they'll deploy a fog architecture of computing over time. So in the mid to long term, when those customers who really do want those differentiated services grow, or the innovation starts to seed more applications in that space, it will become cheaper and cheaper to deliver shorter, new bespoke, customer-specific applications across those edge networks that don't necessarily have to rely on HTTPS or HTTP caching at the edge. So my answer, it was purposefully a little bit vague, Nadine, but in the short term, it's going to cost less to do shorter segments, but in the mid to long term, you're going to find it will probably become cost-effective to move to session-based or alternative protocols. We'll be talking about a lot of this at Content Delivery Summit. So
good. And Krystal, from your standpoint, having worked in live, and you were talking about the three things you tried to balance with user experience, latency, et cetera. How important was a multi-CDN strategy for those large events versus the day-to-day stuff that would be pushed out live?
Yeah, I mean, we use multi-CDN for any events at scale, and it's super important because you can't measure what impact any CDN is gonna have during that game. You can't measure the scale at which that game is gonna be broadcast. Specifically when you think about Super Bowl, we don't know the numbers up front. You can't really load test any of that. So it's important to have a multiple CDN strategy so that you can do some player switching to different CDNs, things like that.
And to a certain extent, that is sort of the broadcast model. You make sure you have redundancy, and in this case, redundancy is in the CDNs. Do you find? I mean, you said for any major event that's done? Was that a learning that we found early on that we needed to have multiple CDNs, or is this something we've just always done, sort of from the beginning of live OTT?
No, I think it's been a learning. I think a lot of people prior have used like single CDN models. I think when I first started, I saw a lot of talk around multi-CDN and the impact it would have. So I do think it's something we've learned over time. And I do think we're in a place now where any event you do at scale, you're sort of expected to have a multi-CDN model.
Okay, got it. Good deal. Okay, so we're down to about the last 6 minutes here. Let's talk about things that we sort of expect to see over the next year. And Krystal, I'll start with you. We've talked about low latency HLS. We've talked about a number of other things. If you're sitting at the end of 2020 looking back, what have we as an industry accomplished, in terms of encoding workflows, codecs, that type of thing?
I'm not sure with that. I mean, when I think about 2020 as a whole, I think about the emergence of streaming. We have Peacock and what's the other, HBO Max coming out. And so streaming is going to scale this year, and I'm really curious to see what the impact is on the industry.
I also noticed, just as an aside, is Picard, is that a CBS All Access?
Original.
Okay, and I noticed that they put it out on YouTube, and within a day they had like 1.1 million views. Is that a model you think that we'll see? I understand that's a business question, but where it gets shown, you get to see it first if you pay for a service, but if you don't, then eventually it makes its way out into the world of those who aren't behind a paywall.
Yeah, I was very curious about that. They also had it up on Pluto for a whole day. So it worked as a strategy. A lot of people were watching it. So I'm intrigued to see what other streamers are doing with that. I know like Peacock is offering like a whole free service for a free tier on their service. And so I'm curious if that's going to drive more viewers to their platform.
Interestingly, with Disney Plus making their announcement, or Disney making their announcement about Disney Plus doing really well, Netflix has actually shot up 10%. So it's that antithetical model. I bought Netflix stock just before they did their earnings announcement, and it fell, and then it came back and went up a little bit, and I sold it, wasn't really paying attention, and looked at it yesterday and was like, whoa. After Disney announces that they've done spectacularly well, suddenly Netflix gets the boost that they should have gotten when they made their earnings announcement last time. So I don't understand the stock market. Anyway.
I don't think anyone does, Tim. Don't you worry.
All right, so let's ask D1, when you're sitting at the end of 2020 looking back, what has higher education learned about streaming in that period of time?
Well, as I said at the beginning, higher education typically moves at a much slower pace than the commercial sector. So it probably wouldn't be that dramatically different from where it is right now. I would expect to see, I've got a number of programs that I'm working on that I'm expecting to see greater adoption of video. And I'm noticing more use of the term streaming. It's starting to come in as well. So again, working with slightly different generations. So my mother lives in the north of England. Streaming means something to her when she goes to the theatre and she gets a theatre troupe show that isn't actually live in her local theatre. It's being streamed from somewhere else. So that sort of model when that generation, which is the same sort of age that some of the professoriate are at, that becomes streaming becomes something that becomes more comprehensible as an idea. So I've got an example from our law school. We're starting to get you get a guest speaker in from the Supreme Court or the High Court, and then it's an evening lecture, and you're able to open that up slightly more to beyond the people who are actually in the room. So I mean, I'd like to see. I'm getting a few more queries about that. I'd like to see the potential being considered slightly more than it is at the moment, and that's one of the things that quite often we're having to sort of sell the ideas and get people used to the terminology before we actually see much movement on the actual technology.
Interesting. Eric, we're down to the 2-minute warning. What are you seeing as you look forward? Obviously, we're shifting stream media east, as you say, to Boston, but just as, as a whole.
I think one of the trends that I'm kind of focusing on right now is I think 2020 is going to be a make or break year for the major live linear services. Hulu's live service, YouTube Live or YouTube TV, Sling TV as well. When my 11-year-old notices that Hulu is buffering, and I tell him, yeah, evidently there's some issues nationwide or in these different markets, and he says, people are going to stop paying for that if that keeps happening. That tells you something about the level of consumer awareness as it relates to quality and cost, particularly as we all predicted, the cost of these live linear services is no cheaper than cable was. And so I think we're going to see an inflection point this year.
And I think that's quite ironic in the fact that you can guarantee delivery on cable unless you have flooding like we have here, where some of the cables are underwater.
Right.
But if the streaming service is the same cost and it buffers, that does beg the question of whether there'll be a reverse cord cut at some point.
Right. Or they'll cut the other cord.
Or
just go to the antenna.
If the satellites have all fallen out of space, there might be no cord to go back to.
Or gone to Chapter 11, but we're not going to talk
exactly.
about that.
Yeah.
All right. So, Dom, take us out. What do you see in the 2020 timeframe?
Well, I've got my head down, focused on my schism, or what you used a different term for it. Bifurcation. I like that term. I might use that for a bit of thesaurus work. So I'm very focused on that schism and got my sort of fingers on the wire of that. And because I think if that happens, it's going to have a roll-on effect to live streaming, to on-demand streaming, and all of the ecosystem of streaming. But it's also going to be a point where the underlying infrastructure that will be serving things like autonomous driving or some of the deep field AI services and so on, those types of, and I did, yes, Eric, I did use the term AI there, but I think that if that's that bifurcation happens, I think that's going to open up a whole wealth of space for innovation in 23. So I'm really excited. If I get that wrong, well, we're all going to be stuck on high latency HTTP, and Nadine will have cheap, shorter chunks to deal with. So how about you, Tim? Quick one.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. ATSC 3.0, I covered that last year. I covered it again for CES. I talked to the CTO at NAB, which is the broadcasting group here in the States, asking about this model of delivery, of on-demand content across the ATSC towers. He said, you're a little ahead of us, probably by a year and a half or so, but I do expect by the end of 2020, as ATSC 3.0 is rolled out more into consumer devices, that we'll begin to see models where it would be pre-caching of the beginning of on-demand content files and that type of thing. So I think in the States, at least, the broadcasters have learned from the streamers, and we may find ourselves on the back foot with them having learned essentially how to do multicasting. So, and
okay, cool. Well, look, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and a quick round of thank yous to our guests and hosts. So, Tim, thank you for steering us through the myriad of disorganized and informal conversation. That's always very helpful. Thank you very much for that. Eric, I will be in touch as you bully Tim and I to write more and more articles for the Sourcebook and various different publications that are coming out. So it's always good to see you, and thank you very much. And of course, Dom, you're down there somewhere. We'll leave you to go back to bullying your professors and doing the difficult things you have to do in HE. And I will see you on the Thursday night show a little bit later tonight.
In a different chat room.
Indeed, in a different chat room. And Krystal, it's been an honour to have you on. I don't know if you're going to be in with the Women in Streaming Media International Women's Day group next month, but we look forward to seeing you at Summit events soon. So thank you for your time as well.
Thank you, guys.
Cool. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to try and press the end buttons and make it look tidy and like we know what we're doing, and they won't be. Oh, look, there you go. Steve Clear arrives in the last minute. It's like that, like in the chat room. It's like the cat that comes after you've locked the door. Anyway, we'll see you all very soon. Have fun. We've been SMAF. We'll see you on the 5th of March.